Hey everyone, Craig for Above and Beyond Minis here, and today we're taking on something a little different. This Tyranid Termagant from Hive Fleet Leviathan. These Xenos are everywhere in starter sets and battle boxes, making them one of the first things many new painters tackle. But instead of stopping at battle ready, we're pushing it further, getting this little terror to display standard. I'll take you step by step from sprue to final details, using rich blends, bold contrasts, and a desert style base to really make it pop. If you've ever struggled to make Tyranids look at their best, stick around, I've got you covered. Let's jump in. Before we get to the fun stuff, we've got to do a little bit of prep work, and trust me, taking the time here will save you a lot of frustration later. First up, clipping the parts from the sprue. Depending on your cutters, you want to cut a little away from the piece rather than right up against it, as this will prevent stress marks, though it will leave more leftover plastic. Finer cutters, like my god hand ones here, won't give me that risk, making cleanup a little easier. Once it's off the sprue, you'll likely have some leftover bits of plastic, as well as some mould lines, these annoying seams that run along the edges of the Mini. These will need to go before we assemble anything, otherwise these can really stand out once the paint goes on. For the large chunks of plastic and really hard to reach mould lines, I suggest using a hobby knife, and very carefully slice them away with a light scraping motion, perpendicular with the Mini. And then with that you can then clean up whatever's left, as well as the mould lines, with sandpaper or sanding sticks for a nice smooth finish. I tend to use a 400 and then 600 grit sanding sponge to ensure that we don't sand off important details, but also finish with a surface perfect for painting. Notice here that I cut away a little bit of the peg on these push fit parts of the Mini. I find they then sit better and have smaller gaps when I do this. Because we're going to be making a custom base for this Mini, I also cut off this peg here. We'll be gluing it instead. Now that everything's cleaned up, it's time to put this guy together, and for that I'm using Sprue glue, a mix of Tamiya extra thin cement and chopped up sprue that creates a really strong plastic bond whilst also working as a handy gap filler. Put the glue on the pegs, but also the flat parts where one part of the Mini meets another that you're sticking together. Apply a small amount and press the pieces together pretty hard, and let the glue do its thing. Since these guys actually push fit, you probably not need to push them for longer than a few seconds. Now sometimes you'll get small gaps where the parts meet. This is where sprue glue really shines, because it acts as a liquid putty as well. I brush a little over the gap and then use straight plastic glue to run over the sprue glue, which then softens and feathers it out, blending it into the existing model and also helping it flow into the gaps for a smooth finish. Unlike super glue, which just sticks pieces together, sprue glue and plastic glue actually melt the plastic, fusing the parts together into one solid piece. Since it's made of plastic, it blends in seamlessly once dry, rather than sitting on top like a filler would. Once it dries, if you need to, you can sand it down just like you did with the mould lines, leaving no trace of the original gap. If needed, you could always apply a second layer, but usually one pass does the job. And with that, we have a fully assembled, gap-free Tyranid ready to go. Some Citadel bases, including these ones, come with pre-moulded peg holes for slotting your Minis, so you technically won't need glue. But since we're making our own base, we're going to fill those in. For that, I'm using Milliput, a two-part epoxy putty that's easy to work with and sets rock hard. Just mix equal parts together and you're good to go. I press a small amount into the peg hole and the central divot, making sure it's flush with the surface. You don't need loads, just enough to fill the gaps. To keep things nice and level, I smooth it out with a damp finger. So now we can make his desert/Mars style base. I start by priming the base in Chaos Black. Once that's dry, I lay down a base coat of Doombull Brown. This step might seem unnecessary, since we'll be layering texture paint over the top anyway, but it's actually really important. It'll ensure that any cracks in the texture will reveal a rich, deep red-brown below it. Next, I apply a layer of Ardcoat Gloss Varnish. It's here for a very specific reason. It makes the texture paint crackle much better when it dries. And now it's time for the Martian Iron Earth. This goes all over the base, and if you want quicker results, you can use a hairdryer to speed up the cracking process. The thicker you put it on, the deeper and more defined the cracks will be, so feel free to vary it up. Think nature. Keep it random. Once that's fully dry, I randomly place patches of Martian Iron Cross down. This is a thicker, chunkier version of Iron Earth, and helps break up the surface with natural variations in height and texture. However, I make sure the model will still sit flat before I commit to the placement of it. Now we deepen all of that texture with a wash of Agrak's Earth Shade. This seeps into the cracks and adds depth and realism, making the dry Martian deserty terrain look more natural. At this stage it will be a bit shiny and wet even once it's dry, but we'll fix that next. Once the wash is dry, I seal everything with Storm Shield, matte varnish. This does two things. It will dull down the shine from the Agraks, but also make the whole base look drier and dustier, just like proper desert. And now for the highlights. So I start with a dry brush of Jacaro Orange, catching the raised areas and bringing out the texture. After that, I then go even lighter with Lugganath Orange, with less on the dry brush. This will help focus only on the highest points for even extra depth. I do this a couple of times between the two paints, tweaking the amounts I put down until I'm happy with the end result. I've said it before, but painting is quite a fluid thing. We'll constantly make tweaks as we progress on a model, so never feel bad if you redo certain things. It's just part of it. To then push the realism even further, I stipple on some burnt sienna pigment from Vallejo. This settles into the cracks and creates a fine dust effect, adding to that final layer of natural variation. And now that the base is looking perfectly dry and dusty, I glue the primed Termagant in place. Since it's perched on a small rock, I also cover that rock with a little Iron Earth, and then dry brush and pigment to match the base. This is a crucial step, as it will tie the mini into the environment, making it look seamless, rather than just two disparate parts of some mini. Now, since the Tyranid's chitin is a deep purple, I wanted to start building a strong colour triad right from the base. The rich orange hues of the terrain act as a complementary contrast colour, making the purple pop even more. Later, I'll be adding vibrant green eyes to complete the classic purple, orange, green triad, ensuring that the whole model has a cohesive, visually striking colour balance. And with that, we've got a fully textured, immersive base that complements the Hive Fleet Leviathan scheme perfectly. Now let's move on to the main event, the paint job. I'm starting with Kislev Flesh. It might seem a little more vibrant than the usual Hive Fleet Leviathan tone, but that's intentional. I'm slightly thinning the paint here, just enough to get smooth coverage without it pulling into details. This is just the lowest tone, and we'll be building up a huge contrast in values as we go. Values being how light and dark the paints we use are. After applying Reikland Flesh Shade to define the shadows, we're going to layer up through Light Flesh from Vallejo and then mix in a touch of white for the final highlights. This contrast, from deep warmth to almost bone pale tones, keeps the skin visually interesting and readable on the tabletop, helping it stand out against the dark chitin. 1 or 2 coats should do the trick, keeping the surface nice and even without obscuring any sculpted texture. One thing I really focus on is getting the most out of a reduced palette. You'll notice I'm using a lot of the same paints from my previous videos. Kislev Flesh and Light Flesh for the Tyranid skin, as well as the Space Marine head video, and even Cantor Blue and the chitin, the same one I used for my Infernus Marine video. This makes it easier for newer painters to follow along without needing hundreds of paints, while still achieving a high display standard. The goal is to show that you don't need a massive collection, just a few well-chosen colours used effectively. With the base coat done, the coverage is smooth, and the details stay crisp and clean. This sets up a strong foundation for shading and highlights, whilst keeping the texture intact. For the chitin, I'm starting with a custom darkest tone, a 1:1 to 0.75 mix of Galvelback Red, Baraknar Burgundy, and Cantor Blue. Instead of just darkening the purples with black, adding Cantor Blue extends the cooler half of the purple, making the shadows richer and more interesting, rather than flat or dull. This keeps everything in the purple family, but with a smoother transition into the darker values, giving us a deeper, more natural look. This base layer sets the stage for later shading, letting us push the contrast even further whilst keeping it visually cohesive with the rest of the model. With the base coat down, you can see how the deep purple tones tie everything together, keeping a consistent, organic look across the model. Don't forget to paint his gun and upper legs with the same colour too. And now for some quick detail work. The tongue gets a coat of Gavelback Red, keeping it in that rich, fleshy tone that ties with the deeper hues of the model. Next, the claws and hooves are based in Eshin Grey, a solid neutral tone that we'll build on later to create a sharp, natural contrast against the warmer tones of the chitin and flesh. And finally, the fangs get a coat of Xandri Dust, which gives them a bone-like look right from the start, making them stand out without clashing against the rest of the palette. Now it's time for shading, one of the most important steps in making the model readable and high contrast. This stage does a few things at once. It deepens the shadows, blacklines details, and recess shades everything in one go, helping define each part of the model. For the chitin, I'm using Drakenhof Nightshade, reinforcing those blue-leaning shadows as we establish it in the base coat. For the flesh and tongue, I'm sticking with Reikland Flesh Shade, keeping those warm undertones in place while still deepening the contrast. Next up, the claws and hooves get Nuln Oil, a simple way to make them feel darker, sharper, and more natural. And finally, the fangs get some Seraphim Sepia, which ages the bone colour slightly, preventing it from looking too fresh or unnatural. With all of the shading in place, every part of the model is now better defined, giving us stronger contrast and separation between elements, ready for the next stage. And here I forgot to paint the metal girder thing that he stood upon earlier, so I just quickly lobbed some lead belcher over the top of that, and then a bit of Nuln Oil. Now that the shade is dry, we're going back to re-establish the mid-tones, bringing back the Kislev flesh whilst keeping all of that nice natural contrast from the wash. The key here is to not completely cover everything. I'm leaving the deepest recesses untouched, so the Reikland flesh shade continues to define the shadows. To smooth the transition, I apply a second, slightly smaller layer of Kislev flesh over the first. This creates an easy blend from the shaded areas up to the pure Kislev flesh, without the need for complicated blending techniques. This method keeps the flesh looking natural and soft, whilst making the details stand out, without harsh transitions. To create a smooth, natural transition, I'm using a technique I call intermediate blending, a mix of wet blending and layering that keeps things simple and forgiving. I start by pre-mixing Kislev flesh and light flesh from Vallejo on my wet palette, setting up the transition before I even touch the model. But instead of just layering, I also blend directly on the miniature, but since these tones are so close, it makes the wet blending effortless. By pushing and pulling the paint where I need it, I can fuzz the colours together in real time, getting that soft organic fade without needing to overwork the surface. So we can see here that I've gone up to very light flesh, pure Vallejo light flesh on his shoulder there. And it's taken a couple of coats, and the blend is awesome. We've got the contrast there, everything. Now, when choosing where to place your highlights, I always recommend starting with a solid reference. I actually demonstrated this in my Infernus Marine video, which I'll link if you want the full breakdown. One of the easiest ways to do this is by taking a photo of your primed model under a bright lamp. This gives a real-world reference for where light naturally falls. But beyond that, it's also important to think volumetrically, meaning how the light interacts with different shapes and forms. Take a look at this breakdown I've made. Here we get the shoulder, bicep and tricep, all of which curve and catch light differently. Rather than just edge highlighting everything, we want to follow the structure of the muscles, keeping the highlight focused on the uppermost planes, where they naturally receive the most light. By combining a photo reference and an understanding of volume, you'll create highlight placement that feels intentional and realistic. Now, the face is where we naturally want the viewer's eye to go first, so it's important to push our contrast here. To reinforce that, I'm taking the light flesh from Vallejo and not stopping there. I'm instead mixing in heavy titanium white from Proacryl. This lets us reach a very bright final highlight, making sure the face stands out against the rest of the model. I apply this in raised areas, the forehead, cheekbones, nose and chin, while keeping the shadows intact to maintain that volume. With this, we're ensuring the face is the most eye-catching part of the mini. Now, moving on to the rest of the flesh highlights, I'm making sure not to overdo it, especially on lower or more obscured areas. Remember, highlights should reinforce the model's natural volumes, not flatten them. I'm sticking to the reference image and keeping my brightest tones on the most exposed areas, like the tops of the shoulders, thighs and forearms, but it's also important to preserve some of the mid-tones, even in the brightest spots. If we highlight everything, we've effectively highlighted nothing. Keeping that contrast makes the mini readable at a glance, which is key for a strong finish. So for the eyes, I'm going to be using Tesseract Glow, giving us that eerie, vibrant green. But for a fluorescent paint to really work, it needs to go over something very, very light. For example here, heavy titanium white. Now, Tesseract Glow really separates, so you'll want to give it a huge shake up, maybe even pop some agitators in there like stainless steel mixing balls. And when it's ready, it will look like that. Now we start by applying a strong white base coat for the eyes. And so I'm using a very, very pointy brush for this, and I cannot stress how important having a very pointy brush is. It makes things like eyes and small details like that infinitely easier. It's best to build up with the white with a couple of thin layers rather than one thick coat, especially in the eye area, and especially if you're using heavy titanium white. Heavy bodied acrylics are thick, so just bear that in mind. But once that's dry, I apply a generous amount of Tesseract Glow to the eyes and the surrounding areas to create a subtle glow effect. Because the eye socket is naturally darker, the glow doesn't affect it as much, which is exactly what we want. The brightest point should be the eyeball itself. Since we've already highlighted the face, the translucency of the Tesseract Glow naturally interacts with the lighter areas, like the cheekbones, helping to sell the glowing effect even more. But because this fluorescent paint is thin and quite tricky to control, I go in afterwards to clean up the cheeks and any areas where the glow might have bled a bit too much. Finally, to push the effect even further, I reinforce the eyes with pretty much pure white, making the brightest part in the centre, giving the impression that the glow is radiating from within the Tyranid's eyes. And now onto the chitin. So we're going to work our way up from the darkest base tone, which was a mix of Baraknar Burgundy, Gavelback Red and Cantor Blue. From there I blend into a mix of just Baraknar Burgundy and Gavelback Red, keeping the shadows nice and rich. Next, I transition into a 1-to-1 mix of Cacophony Purple and Screamer Pink, followed by pure Cacophony in the upper areas. And then finally, to add a crisp edge highlight, I use a 1-to-1 mix of Emperor's Children and Akala Lilac. If you wanted a simpler approach, you could skip the mixes and just go from Cantor and Baraknar into just Baraknar, and then Cacophony, and then lastly, Akala Lilac for the edge highlights. And here you can see that I've set up my palette with all those premix blends on there, so we get that easy intermediate blend. Before I dive into painting the chitin plates, I want to quickly show you the layering process on my hand. This will help visualize how each stage will build up, from the darkest shadows to the final highlights. Starting with the darkest mix, I then blend up through Baraknar and Gavelback Red and transition into Cacophony, and then finally the edge highlight for Emperor's Children and Akala Lilac. This approach helps define each plate and adds depth to the model, preventing the chitin from looking flat. By following this step-to-step method, we get a more natural, organic looking transition, whilst keeping control over the saturation and contrast. I didn't get the footage of this, but before moving into the highlights, I did go back in and re-establish the darkest tone, the Cantor, Gavelback and Baraknar Burgundy. Just like I did with the skin, I'm leaving the deepest recesses untouched, where the wash is settled, keeping those areas rich and dark to get that contrast. From there, I move up to the 1-to-1 mix of Gavelback Red and Baraknar Burgundy. Once that's done, I blend into a mix of Screamer Pink and Cacophony Purple. Again, using that intermediate blending approach, laying down both colours and fuzzing them together on the mini, tapping, pulling, pushing, that sort of thing. So this gives us a nice, smooth, organic transition rather than a harsh shift, which works well for the natural texture of the chitin. And then finally I start introducing some pure Cacophony Purple, hitting the more prominent raised areas to bring out those distinct Leviathan tones. This stage then sets us up for the final highlights, where we can really push that contrast and definition. So with the chitin built up to a nice mid-tone, it's time to push those highlights further. So for this I'm using a mix of Akala Lilac and Emperor's Children, but not straight from the pot mixed together. Instead, I'm taking the mix that's already on my wet palette, which still has quite a lot of influence from the Cacophony Purple blended in. This keeps the transition smooth and prevents the highlights from looking too stark against the previous layers. Rather than edge highlighting everything, I'm focusing on the broad, soft highlights along the raised areas of each chitin plate. This helps reinforce the natural shape whilst keeping the plates looking organic. I'm placing these highlights where the light would naturally catch, gradually refining the shapes we established earlier. By keeping the highlight colour slightly muted at this stage, we make sure that there's still room for that final pop of contrast, and that's where the pure Decala Lilac and Emperor's Children mix comes in. Reserved exclusively for edge highlights and the most prominent sharp points on the plates, this makes sure that those final highlights don't overpower the gradient, but instead reinforce the crisp definition of the chitin. Notice how, for the chitin plates on the head, I've taken a bit of artistic license here. Rather than following the exact same transitions as the rest of his carapace, I've let the mix take on lighter tones much sooner. This helps separate the head from the rest of the body, making sure it stands out as a focal point. Since the face is already our brightest area, this subtle shift reinforces that natural emphasis without looking out of place. It's a small tweak, but one that really helps guide the viewer's eye to the most important part of the model. Now that the chitin is finished, it's time to tackle the exposed synaptic tissue, the softer, more organic sections that break up all that hard armour. So for this I'm using Volupus Pink Contrast Paint. It's got just the right amount of punchy vibrancy to really sell that raw, living flesh look, perfect for the Hive Fleet Leviathan. I'm applying this to all of the exposed muscle groups, the mouth tendons, the joints in the arms and legs, and those sinewy connectors along the limbs. This will create a natural separation between the chitin and the flesh, reinforcing that unsettling look. Of course, the good thing about contrast paint is that it will really settle into that recess, enhancing the depth without requiring additional shading. If you want it even more intense, you can add a second coat in the deeper folds, but usually one pass is enough. So this step makes a huge difference in giving the Tyranid that alien, unsettling feel, whilst also completing our purple, orange, green colour triad, as this pink sits perfectly between the chitin and the flesh tones, helping everything feel harmonious. I thought I'd just spend a minute here showing you the edge highlighting that I use on the gun's ridge that you can use obviously anywhere else. This is where brush control really matters, so I take my time and stabilise my hand as much as possible. I'm using fresh paint straight from the wet palette, thin enough to flow smoothly, but not so thin that it will run. Before actually touching the model, I do a few practice swipes in the air, keeping the motion light and controlled. Then, as I'm moving closer, as soon as I make contact, without adjusting my position, I just use soft, consistent strokes until I build up that razor-sharp highlight. For the fangs, I'm keeping things muted and natural, so I go back in with some Xandru Dust as the base, being a nice earthy tone that keeps the teeth looking grimy and organic rather than bright and clean. I then add a small highlight of Ushabti Bone, but I keep it subtle, just on the edges and tips. I don't want the fangs to be too bright, because if they're too pale, they'll blend in into the face rather than standing out. For the tongue, I want to add a bit more depth and definition, so I'm using Gavelback Red as my base, and then wet blending into Kislev Flesh. That will create a paler, more defined tip. Since these colours are quite different, I start with the red and then gradually work into the Kislev Flesh whilst the paint is still wet. I push and pull the colours together using small controlled strokes to blend the transition smoothly. The subtle gradient gives the tongue a more organic look, breaking up the flat colour and making it more three-dimensional, helping it stand out against the darker mouth and the gums without looking unnatural. Now, to sharpen the hooves and claws, I'm using a mix of Eshin Grey, the original shade, and Heavy Titanium White to make a mid-grey tone. This will give us a crisp, clean highlight without making it really stark if we use something like pure white. So I'm applying this carefully along the edges, keeping my brush at an angle so the highlight naturally catches just the sharpest points. This will help define the shape whilst making the claws and hooves feel dense and solid without looking too soft. Again, it's a small detail, but it really does help with the readability and makes those elements stand out against the rest of the model. Now, to bring the base to life, though not too much light as we want it to look a bit arid, I'm adding some Gamer Grass Tufts. I'm using a mix of quite pale green, almost brown tufts, which reinforce that dry, barren environment, but then also some more saturated green tufts to subtly reinforce our purple-orange-green triad. Putting these down strategically, I make sure that they don't overwhelm the scene, keeping things random again, but just adding enough visual interest. The trick is to vary the placement so it looks organic and natural rather than too symmetrical or artificial. These little additions help ground the model in the environment, making the base feel like an extension of the Tyranid rather than something it's just standing on. Another way that we can bring in some contrast to the mini is contrast of finish. Now, I've applied AK Interactive Ultra Matte Varnish to pretty much all of the mini, but instead for his chitin I've actually used Storm Shield, which is still a matte varnish but not as matte, so that makes the chitin slightly more shiny compared to the rest of him. Now, to make sure the tufts don't look too pristine, I'm dusting them with a bit of our burnt sienna pigment. This will help them feel more rooted in the environment rather than just stuck on top. And now that the Tyranid is fully painted and varnished, I use this opportunity to add the pigment to his hooves and legs to make him look like he has actually been walking across this desert. For one of the final touches, I'm using some standard Uhu glue to add some Drool to the mouth. And this again helps reinforce that organic nature of the mini, making it feel more alive and visceral. Unlike the clean, structured look of something like an Adeptus Mechanicus or Necron, Tyranids are creatures, so let's remember that. The small details like this really sell the difference. So just pull thin strands of Uhu glue between the teeth, letting gravity do most of the work. I use a toothpick here that I've broken in half, so it's really quite thin, so we only get a small amount of glue. And then just stretch it out, get those perfect slimy strands. Just a small effect, but it makes a big impact. I won't put the footage here just in case YouTube have an issue with it, but finally, to push the gruesome predatory nature of the Tyranid, I do the same again with the Uhu glue, but then cover it in Blood for the Blood God. And lastly, don't underestimate putting a nice dark rim to finish off the mini, simply here with some Abaddon Black. And there we have it. This Hive Fleet Leviathan Tyranid is fully painted and ready to devour the galaxy. If you found this guide helpful, please be sure to hit that like and subscribe. It really helps me out. There's plenty more painting guides on the way. If you want to see how I painted the Space Marine counterpart in the starter sets, check out the video here. And if you want more tips, techniques and project updates, please follow me on Instagram and Blue Sky at Above and Beyond Minis. But with that, thank you very much, and I'll see you next time.